Nadia Bilchik is a television news anchor, keynote speaker, author, trainer, and communications consultant.
19 number one best-selling
have been nominated and won so many awards throughout your careers.
She has a wealth of experience interviewing and consulting with well-renowned figures, celebrities, and corporations. Nadia speaks on how to get people to like you, trust you, and want to do business with you.
Over the last few weeks, the entire world has been monitoring the treatment of your grandfather, Nelson Mandela. And my job was to introduce it and provide.
With topics like leveraging the power of your personal presence, networking for success, and lighting the fire. Nadia Bilchik.
And a very good Monday morning. And I'm so delighted this morning to be joined by Alain Hunkins. And Alain has written a book called Cracking the Leadership Code. And it's something we're all fascinated by. What is leadership? Is a leader born or are they cultivated? So answering all your questions on leadership and how to really crack that leadership code is my guest. And Alain, when you are introducing yourself to an audience, what do you say?
Well, oftentimes I start with the fact that I have this name, Alain. And it's people go, what's that? Because I'm an American and it's a French name. So I oftentimes just like, let's get the elephant out of the room because it's funny. And that in some ways is a metaphor for leadership, if you think about it, because we need to feel comfortable with the people that we're with. And when you have that little sense of foreignness, whether literal in my case of my name or figurative, what can you do to bridge the gap, to make the transition and to put people at ease? So obviously I do it through humor. I talk about the fact that when I was growing up in Flushing, Queens, I got called all sorts of names.
And no, I did not call you Alan. I said Alain.
Alain, exactly.
Alain.
Exactly. So how I introduce myself. So beyond that, how I start then, beyond that piece is the fact that many of us, such as myself, I got interested in leadership because originally I was a high performer and I was seen by my leaders. And it seemed to me that my leaders definitely made a difference in terms of the environment that I was in. And what I found over the years is that leadership doesn't so much make a difference as leaders are the difference. And what I find is most people who wind up in leadership roles were high performers who got things done. But here's the critical difference, Nadia, is that there's a big difference between being a high performer and being able to facilitate high performance in others. And you cannot close that gap by just working harder. And usually I see the heads nodding and people going, yes, because we recognize that this is endemic of the entire field of leadership, is that, as Marshall Goldsmith famously wrote in his book, what got you here won't get you there. So that's where I usually start from. And then I sometimes go into the history of how we got into this place, because the research shows that the state of leadership is pretty poor. Only about 23% of people believe their leaders are effective at all.
So you speak about three things. So if we can go through those three things and just give everybody a moment, if you want to grab a pen and paper, if you're driving, please don't, or type it into your phone. But, share three things with us and that really can make a difference. And of course, Alain, this isn't only to people who are already in leadership positions, but people who are aspirational or what we call emerging leaders.
Yeah, sure. And I think probably the best way to explain these three secrets is actually through a story. So I met a man named Matt, and Matt is the #1 ranked district manager out of 100 out of a national franchise here in the United States. Now, I said, Matt, you're #1 out of 100. That's impressive. Have you always been such a high performing leader? He said, not at all. In fact, when he started, he was about 84th on the list. And I said, so what changed? He said, when he started as a leader, and I think a lot of us can resonate with this, he got promoted to district manager. He thought, I'm in charge. I'm the boss. I'm the district manager. And he thought his job was to be the fixer. So he oversaw 9 different stores and store managers. And every morning he would get a printout of their key performance metrics that they called the hot list. So the first thing every day that Matt would do is look at the hot list and see what was in red and not measuring up. He'd circle those things, and then he'd drive from store to store and tell his managers, this is wrong. You need to fix this. Go do this. And he was going all day long from place to place, and he was working hard and struggling and going nowhere. And then he said the worst day was the day he realized there were people in his stores that were quitting. He didn't even know what their names were. And he had that kind of insight moment, wake up call, where he said, I need to change my approach. And so what he started doing was going into the stores, but instead of just going barking instructions, he started to get to know his store managers and say, Nadia, how was your weekend? How are you? And then he'd still have the list, the hot list, but instead of saying, this is wrong, you need to fix this, he'd share the data and say, what do you think we should do? And then together they'd co-create solutions. And what he noticed is that's when his performance started to improve. And Matt said, the key to ultimately delivering on the numbers was to stop focusing on the numbers and instead to start focusing on the people, because it was the people that were making the numbers.
So is that the first secret?
Well, this is all three secrets all together. So what Matt describes are these three. So the first is connection, which is the first secret is, and I don't care what industry you're in, if you're in retail or pharmaceuticals or high tech, you're in the human being business because everything gets done through and with people. So what Matt first shows is connection, building real human to human relationships with people that are built on empathy, showing people that you understand them and care how they feel, which is now more than ever since coronavirus pandemic is recognizing, we are all human, we're all vulnerable, we all have needs outside of our functional roles, and leaders have to help people to address those needs. So that's the first C, the secret is connection. The next thing that Matt did was instead of barking orders and giving data, he started facilitating insight. And so the second one is around communication. And not so much that we're trying to communicate for communication's sake, but what we're really trying to do is create shared understanding. And that is so important because shared understanding creates a solid platform on which we can take all future action. If that platform is solid, we'll make good decisions and get great results. And if it's weak and wobbly, we're going to make bad decisions and get bad results. And then the third C, Nadia, is around collaboration. That for people to do their best work, we need to create an environment where they can thrive. And so leaders need to create this high-touch, collaborative environment. And so that's what Matt did. And the three secrets are then connection, communication, and collaboration.
And so succinctly and well articulated. So Alain, in a virtual world, and we were discussing the fact that your 14-year-old daughter has now had 2 birthdays in lockdown. So we'll get to that in a moment. So in a virtual world, how do we do the connection, the communication, the collaboration?
Yeah, so here's the thing. It takes a lot more intention. I was just speaking to a client last week who said one of our team members has been with us for 15 years and they're retiring. In the old days, the pre-pandemic days, we would just go out to lunch and someone would say a little thing with a glass of whatever and we have a toast and that would have felt like closure. How do you do that when people are virtual? You have to be so much more intentional. So in terms of connection, communication, and collaboration, those principles have been around for thousands of years in terms of how people work well together. Now, in this virtual world, we need to be intentional. So for example, as a leader, knowing that leadership at its core is a one-on-one relationship, are you investing your time in having one-on-one meetings with your people? And people say, I don't have time for that. It's like, where are you spending your time? Because if you're not investing in your people, what are they doing and how are they doing that? And my suggestion for all the listeners here would be, here's 3 simple questions that don't have to take a lot of time, but if you're intentional about how you use them, can reap great rewards. 3 questions are simple. Number 1, how are you feeling today? And not just, I'm fine, how are you? I mean, but really taking that moment. It may feel expansive, but it's amazing how just giving people some space, and you know this from being a professional interviewer, Nadia, is that giving people that silence and space. How are you feeling today? So that's question number 1. Number 2, what's distracting you or what's on your mind? Like the fact is there's so much going on right now. So one thing to do to help people to focus on the work at hand is just to say, what's on your mind? And maybe it's nothing, but maybe it's something. And for you as the leader, to be able to hold space and to see them and to recognize them. So what's on your mind? And then the third question, how can I support you? Right. And so you can do all of that. And if you turn that into a ritual where people know to expect those questions, it gives them this moment to settle in and creates what Amy Edmondson, professor at Harvard, would call psychological safety. This idea of how do we settle in and we feel safe that we can speak up, that we can contribute, and now we're engaged. Now we're committed. We're not just phoning it in and going through the motions. So something that any of us can do to be able to practice connection, communication, and collaboration virtually.
And it's so interesting, Alain, because you and I both have theater backgrounds,
yes,
which means we understand the verbal, what is being said, and the non-verbal, if you notice your tone and intonation when you said that. And something that people forget is there's a big difference, and you just demonstrated it between how you feeling, dismissive, and how are you feeling? And there's a big difference between, well, let me know how I can support you, and what is something specific I can do right now to support you with intention and space. And you demonstrated that. And just our reminder that so much of our communication is not what is being said, but is my camera on? Am I looking directly at the person and listening to them? Do I look like I'm not distracted myself?
Yes. The whole idea of being present and being focused cannot be undervalued. It's interesting. We were talking off camera. Yes, today is my daughter's 14th birthday.
Yes.
And she got up early. And what did she want more than anything else this morning? She wanted to open her presents and her birthday cards that have been coming in the mail from relatives all over the place. And she wanted us to watch her open them. Think about that. That's a very human impulse. Don't we all want that? I don't want to open my cards and my presents by myself. It's like going out to a fancy restaurant table for one. I want to share. I want to share this experience with everybody else. And in that moment, what my daughter wanted was to be seen. She wanted to be recognized. And I thought about this. Maybe I'll turn it into a blog post later. Is we all want this. And so as leaders, to recognize part of your job is to see people and to give them, like you said, the time, the attention, the focus, so that they feel seen, because then they know that they matter. There's an old saying, and I've worked remotely for 20 years. At one point, I was an employee of a company based in Canada while I lived in the United States. And there's very much an out of sight, out of mind syndrome. So how do you make people more visible? By giving them more opportunities to be seen.
And again, the challenges that people face in a virtual world. So you're talking about what a leader can do. Can we switch it around and talk about people who are aspirational, who are emerging leaders? And one of the things that's lost during this pandemic is the ability to have more exposure, to be in front of people. And one of the things I've been working with my clients and audience on is, how do you give yourself visibility in a virtual world? So I love your thoughts on that. How do you demonstrate leadership, even if you aren't in a leadership position, when you're doing it virtually?
Yeah, I love this question. So one of the things, if we think about in being able for leaders, and I'm saying leader not by position or title, but just in terms of our influence and authority, is we all talk about the importance of employee engagement. I'm a huge believer that employee engagement only comes from leadership engagement. So I share all that as a preface, because we think about how can you create more visibility is to engage with those around you, engage in the work they're doing. So if you have opportunities to see what people are doing, how can you engage with that? How can you comment on that? So for example, if you're in a community of practice with peers on LinkedIn, for example, and one of your peers is posting something they're doing, engage with that. Don't just scroll by, but like it, comment on it. Bring a dialogue, bring a different perspective. If there are open opportunities to meet other people, do you meet them? How do you engage with them? How do you target the people you want to spend time with? How do you learn about them? I mean, this is the beauty of our information age, is that so much knowledge is at your fingertips. How are you using that to engage with those around you and being proactive? I mean, one of the challenges that I think a lot of people face around visibility is you have to be your own marketing department. I have a mentor. I grew up in the mindset that good work should speak for itself. And if you spoke too loudly, you were boasting. And so just let the work speak for itself, which may work in a school environment, but in the business world, you have to find ways to toot your own horn in a tactful, professional way.
Yes. Don't you love that?
Yeah, and you have to get other people to toot your horn for you. And part of that is by looking for opportunities as you are engaging with others. How can you add value? So, for example, if someone posts something on a subject and you have some expertise around it, or you've read some things, which also you have expertise on now, like, oh, that makes me think of, do you know this book? And then sending them the link. And also, another way in terms of increasing visibility is, and this has been a mantra of mine for some time, is there something that you can do to make someone else's life easier? Can you reduce the friction for them? So, for example, instead of saying, oh, you should find this book, it's really related to what you do, why don't you include the link to the book or a summary or a digest of that book for them, because you've made it that much easier for them to start to take advantage of the resource that you're offering. So looking for ways to lean in and reduce the friction. Basically, we become valuable when we provide value for others. So a way to increase visibility is be on the lookout and be visibly looking for, how can I add value to the people around me?
You have said that so well. You know, we speak about networking as being a go-giver as much as a go-getter. And the reality is that people often go, well, what do I have to give? And you've explained so well that sometimes what you have to give is a resource or an idea. Or, you know, you've told me about your daughter having a birthday in lockdown, and I see something about celebrating your child in lockdown, and I send you something. I thought about you. That's a form of giving. Yes. You also said something else, and it reminds me of that wonderful book called Brag, How to Toot Your Own Horn Without Blowing It. And the idea behind tooting your own horn without blowing it is that you share your skills, expertise, but you also have the ability to say what's in it for the other person. And that's a discussion that we should have, is how do you self-promote in a way that feels authentic and doesn't feel like bragging, because it really is offering yourself as a resource. So there's so much there. Alain, I also wanted to talk about the fact that you only came back to America in 2020, and you've had a lot of experience living in other countries. How has that changed your perspective in terms of the work you do and leadership?
Oh, wow. That's a big question. That's a great question. As I think about, I lived in the Netherlands most recently for 2 years, moving back to the United States in August of 2020. So one of the things just around leadership is, and this is important for anyone who does work globally in any way, is to recognize that we have certain cultural signifiers for, as an American, I can use certain American idioms and slang that for anyone from here feels completely comfortable. But if I'm talking to a global audience who's not from here, that may not play so well. So I have to understand what I'm saying and how I'm saying it, and also recognizing that, different cultures also have different general cultural personality styles. So, for example, in the United States, we are a pretty direct culture. So if I ask people a question and I say, does that all make sense? If they say yes or no, I'll take them at face value. Whereas if I work in South Asian cultures, for example, if I ask the same question, people will say yes because it's impolite not to say yes. So
yes.
I have to be aware. And the Dutch tend to be pretty direct around things. So they are very, it's funny because I'm from New York City, which is a very, direct, tell you like, hey, forget about it, get out of my face kind of look.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
So, and actually I found that when I was in the Netherlands, I went, oh, this feels familiar, because, New York it was New Amsterdam before it was New York. And there's a certain kind of directness to the Dutch as well in terms of how things play out. So it's understanding those cultural contexts and realizing that underneath all of the different nuances of culture, there are these core fundamental needs. The fact is, we all want to be seen, we all want to be recognized, we all want to be valued. How we express those may be manifested differently in different cultures, but at its core, there are these human elements, and we want to be able to tie into those different elements if we want to lead successfully.
So a friend of mine, Paula Caligari, wrote a book called Cultural Agility. And she does assessments around people who have the propensity and the ability and the capability to take global positions and people who need more help in doing so, because it does require certain sensibilities to adapt, right? To be culturally agile, which you clearly were. When you look at now that we're in our virtual worlds, and you, like me, suddenly our audiences are all over the world, but they're virtual. For people who are in global companies, who are leading global teams, who are having to communicate, what are some questions? And I have some ideas of what I ask people if I've got people in my audience who are from Japan and India and sometimes in Australia all in one. Just some ideas of, how can we show this kind of curiosity that shows respect without being in any way offensive?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I would go back to the fundamental, what are some broad, open-ended questions that you can ask without any attachment to what the answers might be, and just being very broad and open. So what are the biggest challenges that you're facing in your work right now? And creating a dialogue. Again, if we want to have people engaged, we need to engage them. So if there are ways to do that, now you can do that if you're with a group. There's ways to do that creatively through technology and all sorts of online surveys or via phone. Is how do you create some dialogue rather than it just being monologue? And showing people that you understand where they're coming from. Because when they do that, they go, oh, he or she, they get me, they understand what I'm doing. So I'd start, and it starts really, and it's funny, this comes back to connection, it comes back to empathy, and it comes back through listening with purpose, which is about being open, asking open questions, and really being curious, which is something you're fabulous with, Nadia, is that constant curiosity. Like, what do you think about this? And starting that as the basis for exploration. Now, obviously, you have an agenda, you're a subject matter expert, but instead of being directive, I have to get here. It's if I know that's where I want to end up, using these questions to be the fuel to allow us to travel this road to our final destination together. Because it's like goes back to the famous quote that Lao Tzu said about leadership thousands of years ago, which was, the worst leader people despise. The good leader people revere, but the best leaders are the ones where the people say, we did it ourselves. So
that's beautiful. I think can you repeat that. Let's repeat that.
Yeah, it's Lao Tzu, and said the worst leaders people despise. The good leaders people revere, but the best leaders are the ones where the people say, we did it ourselves.
So just coming up in your experience, personally or professionally, who are the best leaders?
Wow. So personally, I'm going to go. My wife, Mary, is an amazing leader. And I say that because she was the one who had a vision for how we would raise our children. I'd love to say that this was me, but it wasn't. It was her. And one of her core tenets around parenting was a refusal to engage in power struggle. I think every single parent, and I know, and I've been there and I've done it.
This is a conversation we need, Mary. Tell us.
Yeah. So here's the thing. So she viscerally remembers, the way she described it, as until the age of 6, she could do no wrong. And then suddenly at the age of 6 or 7, suddenly her parents put these demands on her, and her entire worldview shattered of, wait, what happened to my beautiful, wonderful life? It's my parents are talking to me the way a lot of parents do, which is do this, because I'm your mom, because I'm your dad. That's why. This is the way most of us were raised of a certain generation. And she viscerally remembered that and said, I'm not going to raise my kids that way.
Well, how did she?
Well, what it takes, she does, is it's a lot of patience. And it's this idea of whether they're a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, treating them with a level of respect and patience, which at certain points takes an infinite amount of patience. And I was like, huge, more than I had. But and I'll give you an example of this, right? So, and I remember one time my son, Alex, who's now 16, almost 17, was 4. And I was trying to get him out to preschool. And it was a rainy, drizzly day. And I was trying to get his little galoshes on. And anyone who's had kids knows that getting extra layers and boot, it takes more time. And of course, I didn't spend a lot of time. I was just, come on. And then, of course, I got frustrated. I'm like, come on, Alex, and my voice started to raise and all. And before I know it, I've got this sobbing 4-year-old because in his world, I'm now yelling at him, and he's like, Dad's upset with me. And it turned into, and it was just, again, not one of my best parenting moments at all. And I felt terrible.
What did Mary do?
Well, I talked with Mary about it, and she said, "Okay, Alain, I hear you." She said she debriefed me. She said, "So let me ask you, what time did you leave the house?" I said, "Well, I left at 10 to 9, like we always do." She said, "Yeah, like we always do. Do you know it takes more time to get boots on?" "Yeah." "So what were you doing 10 minutes earlier that you weren't setting up Alex for success before?" Is realizing instead of the tendency, and this is a human thing, when something's wrong, whose fault is it? Oh, it's their fault, as opposed to as the leader in the look, I'm the adult, he's 4. What was I doing to set him up, to create the environment earlier that we need extra time and I need to budget for that time and so that I can be calm and patient and helping the way I need to help. And so, yeah, it takes more time up front, but here's the payoff because our kids are now, my daughter just turned 14 today, and people say, "Oh, 14, good luck with that." It's the old, "You've got teenagers," eye roll, that, oh gosh, teenagers, they're a hand. And we haven't had any of that. And I'd love to take credit for it. I'm going to give 99% of the credit to my wife, Mary, because I think the reason that we're not getting this teenage rebellion, and again, I'd like to say it's more than a sample size of one. Is part of it is that we've created engaged and cared for children who haven't had those breaches of trust that I think many of us have experienced. And, I know that I had, for me, is when I got to be a teenager and had that agency, I wanted to get out of there. I wanted to rebel. And so that's just an example of a leader. And again, I wasn't expecting we talk about this,
Okay.
but
No.
yeah,
I think that's a whole other conversation because
yeah.
Talk about the challenges parents are having to face with children at home. It's so critical. So I think we have you and Mary on for a long discussion. I'd love to hear about that.
Sure.
So Mary being one, but I mean, that's influence. John Maxwell famously says leadership is nothing more than the ability to influence and persuade.
Yes.
So she's done that masterfully, and you've learned from her. And in terms of, we look at leaders, and I know in your classes and in my sessions, I always begin with who has been an exemplary leader in your life, personally or professionally.
Yes.
And I always quote, Nelson Mandela. I mean, talk about the ability to persuade and influence. And if you go back from the history of South Africa, things could have been so different when he became the president.
Yeah. Yes.
And he really successfully managed to create a democratic South Africa. I'm not saying with perfection, but remarkable. So leaders who exemplify connection, communication, collaboration, the ones that come to mind, is it Elon Musk? Is it Steve Jobs? Who comes to mind in your classes, in your sessions?
Yeah, it's interesting because the research on this would find that, and I don't want to discount the Nelson Mandelas of the world, they're amazing. And what we find is when we say, think of leaders that you admire the most, what usually comes out are leaders that people know personally. So those could be a family member, a coach, a teacher, a first or second supervisor. It's people that you actually have had that connection with, as opposed to the Mahatma Gandhis. Unless you've worked with them and met with them, which is amazing, and they're inspiring in some ways. So it turns out to be people that you know. I mean, I've read. I mean, certainly, hearing Mandela's story, reading through his autobiography. The stories of, how he dealt with, for example, the South African rugby team and kind of using rugby as a unifying force for the country. Amazing. I'll share an example of a leader that I've worked with who was at the time, it was the CEO of HSBC USA, a woman named Irene Dorner, who was at one point voted the most powerful woman in banking. Irene Dorner was at the helm of HSBC when they were they went through a huge scandal with the United States government, where there was all sorts of issues of money laundering, for a bunch of their clients that was not paid attention to, and they were slapped with $1 billion fine and a deferred prosecution agreement. They had to get their act together, and she had sort of inherited this mess, and she had to testify in front of Congress and really hold a calm center. And at the same time, she knew that they needed to change the culture of the bank. And so what I found and I met Irene, I worked with Irene, is whenever I was with Irene, one of the things I noticed is that when she would speak to me, and she's the CEO of a 14,000 person organization, very busy, but when she'd speak to me, completely present, like there was no one else in the room and no one more important than me. And I've talked to so many people who have worked with Irene who have said the exact same thing. So it's that ability to connect starting from there, and the presence. And you always felt like, and even when she would make a video to the company, it always felt authentic, it felt genuine, it felt personal, and it was always very clear about, this is what we're trying to do, and this is what you can do. So a clear call to action, a clear understanding of the issue. And I think people always felt, when they walked away from an interaction with Irene, they felt better for it. So that's another example of someone.
Great example. And Alain, it's interesting because Diane Vineyard says, good reminders today. And what that is, often in my sessions, I say, what I'm going to share with you is a series of BLOs. And people say, what is a BLO? And I say, oh, a blinding light of the obvious. But just because these are foundational things doesn't mean we apply it. And I think for your role as a facilitator, speaker, and I see it certainly as my role, is how do we take these foundational things? I mean, most leaders know connection, making people feel valued is critical for engagement.
Yes.
But are you doing it right now? Are you doing it today? Or are you engaged in the proverbial Stephen Covey whirlwind of activity? You know, I've got so much to do. I'm so distracted, which brings up socially, even, I find people are on their phones. And it has become quite normal in social interactions for people to get sucked into. I am thinking about, Alain, is having signs beautifully made. I'm going to ask my wonderful graphic designer, Brittany, if you're here, to say, this is a no phone zone unless an emergency.
Mm-hmm.
How have you with teenagers? I mean, do you have no phone meals? Like, how do we incorporate this idea of, first of all, getting the next generation to be leaders where they're actually communicating and not doing it via this? And I think we're all guilty. Are we starting a movement of being present, no phone zone?
Yeah, you bring up such a good point here, Nadia. I think this whole idea of how do we bring presence? Let's face it, it is the most valuable resource we have. Our time and our attention, where we spend it, is by far the most valuable resource. And it's interesting because you'll hear studies of, no, actually, and the generational studies of, no, I actually prefer to do this in text, except when you don't. Right. So the fact is, underneath it, there's a certain point you're going to want.
I care about you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You're going to want to have that. Or, oh, it doesn't, it doesn't bother me when I do it, but it bothers me when you do it. So this is indicative. So yeah, I mean, certainly with our kids, we waited. They were those kids who had those parents who didn't get their kids phones at the age of 8 or 9.
Yeah, but you were living, okay, so, and you were living in a country at the time. Where were you living at the time?
Well, my son didn't get a phone until his second year in the Netherlands. And so the first couple of years, our kids didn't have phones, and they were off and out, and we just set expectations of, you're home by this time and we trust you, in terms of things. And people
you and Mary definitely are coming on to discuss parenting, because parenting, screen ages and parenting in an age of digital obsession, I think is a great challenge. My daughters are 30 and 27. So although we were in a digital world, nothing is consuming as it is right now.
Oh, exactly. In fact, it's interesting because my daughter, who actually just got a phone, she got a phone so she could WhatsApp her friends back in the Netherlands. So it's not an actual phone. She's not that into it. And what she noticed is a lot of her friends, they go over to do a play date and they're all on their phones. It's like, why am I here? And she's great because she'll call us if my wife and I have our phones. And she's like, are we having dinner? Or are we having our phones? Like, she'll call the rest of us out on it, which I really appreciate. But for the most part,
it's an important, because you raised so many good questions today.
Yeah.
I'm going to make sure that if people want to reach you, and by the way, Altabakan Pathan says he learned English by watching my videos. Fantastic. Well, that's amazing. Or maybe Alain's videos, but I think between the two of us, we could do some very good videos. Alain, I always tell you, it's such a pleasure because you have this wonderful voice. I can see you doing Shakespeare. If people want to reach you or know more about you, what is the best way? I'm going to type it into the comments.
Sure. Probably the easiest place to go is www.crackingtheleadershipcode.com. That is the book's code.com. It's all one word. It's the book's webpage. And while you're there, you can actually download the first chapter of the book, and that connects right to the AlainHunkins.com website. So you can learn all about the work that I do working with individuals, teams, and organizations, either through coaching, speaking, training, or consulting. And the goal is to help people adopt what I call a facilitative mindset so that we can all achieve our performance goals easier.
And never been more critical, where employee engagement, we're getting people involved at a time where there's so many challenges. I mean, you and I are saying, here it is, a year ago, I was still doing in-person facilitation. And a year later, you and I have met virtually. I look forward to meeting you in person.
Me too.
Alain, thank you so much. I mean, it's going from a connection to a communication. Well, connection, communication, and collaboration are the three secrets. And you can really take us through how to do it more skillfully. And are we doing that? And I think our mantra today, for me too, believe me, we say in the world of professional speaking, we teach what we most need to learn. The concept of being present. And as you said, the biggest gift you can give, the biggest present is your presence. I'm going to reinstate that blog. I think I wrote it a while back. It's such a universal thing. Happy birthday to your 14-year-old. We do look forward to you and Mary. And Diane says she loved the conversation. You were correct. Now let's go and apply. And I think that's the thing. Let's make it application week. Somebody sent out a quote the other day, if we all applied our knowledge, we'd all have a six-pack and we'd all be, we know what we need to do, but I think you've broken it down so well into what can we do differently. So before I have my final thoughts for this week, your final thoughts to our beautiful audience, be they watching live or later recorded.
Yeah. So thank you for this conversation, first of all, Nadia. And I'd say final thoughts is, it's not a question of knowledge. It's a question of building and embedding habits. And the way to do that is to start small and celebrate the little victories, and then to continue to grow. It's that marginal 1% incremental growth, and really focusing on just a couple of things, even one thing at a time, because what my work is turning into is about helping leaders to embed habits, because otherwise we hang out in the level of overeducated insight and none of it gets applied. So look for opportunities to embed those habits.
Thank you. Cracking the leadership code. And my thoughts for today is really take a moment. And for those of us like Alain and I, who are more fast-paced and outspoken, our natural inclination, and if you're anything like us, really the ability to just, and Alain said it so well, is give people space. And in the virtual world, sometimes it takes a beat to hear what people are saying, and just go, am I really hearing what they're saying? And am I responding to them and not trying to think about the next thought and idea? And I know that's certainly a challenge for me. And it's something I am definitely going to apply this week, because Maya Angelou said it so beautifully, didn't she, Alain? People don't remember exactly what you say, but they always remember the way you make them feel. Alain Hunkins, thank you so much for joining us. And remember, it's cracking the leadership code. It's three things. It's connecting, it's communicating, and it's collaborating. And happy birthday to your 14-year-old. And look forward to many more fabulous conversations.
Thank you so much, Nadia. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.